Welcome, everybody, and particularly welcome to Andy, of course. Very warm welcome to Andy, Fitz alum. And now, I gather you're now King of the North, is your normal terminology. I know it's you, Andy, but there you go. I first asked Andy to come and talk with us pre-COVID, which feels like a different life, of course, because actually I was really interested to know what was happening around devolution of health and social care, because you were the first place to have the experiment on that. But obviously, as we all know, Andy's been in the middle of handling the COVID epidemic in your locality, but also battling somewhat with central government. Andy was born in Aintree, but famously is an Everton fan. You were at school, I know, near and represented Lee as its MP from 2001 to 17, and then Mayor of Greater Manchester since 2017. So for me, that's a shift along as what I call the East Lancs Road. Other people may call it different, but all in the Northwest and all in a relatively small area.
See the East Lancs Road from where I am right now, Sally. So, and you're older.
Back to my roots. From researcher to special advisor, as MP, as minister, cabinet minister, you were always really heavily involved in sports and culture and health, although you obviously also did your stint in the Home Office and Treasury. I think in some ways, though, a bit personally, I suppose, I think people felt they understood you much more deeply through the long years around Hillsborough, where you movingly got a standing ovation at Anfield in 2014, and you were applauded in the House of Commons in 2016, which is a very, very, very rare event, for your absolute determination to get justice for the victims' families. And I think in many ways, for a lot of people, that put you in a different place than a lot of other politicians. When Andy was elected mayor in 2017, he argued that politics was too London-centric, and I gather you said, we are going to change politics and make it work better for people. So, Andy, how's it going? Over to you.
Well, that's a big question, big introduction there, Sally, but thank you so much, and wonderful to be back at home, as I always do feel at home when I'm talking to a Fitz crowd. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Yeah, it's going okay. It's going okay, but we're hitting an interesting moment, and maybe I'll get back to that. But the big question I was going to address tonight is, what does COVID and the response to it tell us about the country we live in, and what might need to change about it? So that's what I wanted to kind of begin with. And I suppose there's a related question to that: why has the north of England been hit so much harder than other parts of the country? Because we have, if you look at the case numbers. So I could give you off the cuff sort of answers in terms of what I feel about those things, but rarely for me, I'm going to actually point you to evidence. I realise I'm with a Cambridge crowd here, and I need to up my game. So the answer to the question, why was the north hit so hard, I think you could find actually pre-pandemic. So look up these two reports, both published in February 2020. The UK 2070 Commission, which was headed by Lord Bob Kerslake, former head of the UK Civil Service. That's number one. Number two, health equity in England, the Marmot report 10 years on. So I'll just talk briefly about those two reports as to why they tell us what was about to happen in March and the rest of the year. So to turn to the UK 2070 report first, the central finding of that commission, which was into the regional and spatial inequality in the UK, and particularly within England, basically it said that England is the most regionally unbalanced country in the OECD, number one, but secondly, the most politically over-centralised. And the Commission made the argument that there was a correlation between those two things. If you vest almost the whole of the political power of the country in one postcode, SW1A0AA, it is inevitable that you will not have a system of governance in the country that works equally for all constituent regions and nations. And obviously we've seen that argument play out in Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland over the years, but it is now absolutely playing out in England. And I would go further and say actually that the north-south divide in England was in effect created by Westminster over centuries and a failure to invest equally in all parts of the country. It's a phrase I use a lot, but I do think our national political system is unduly London-centric in its decision-making. And it has invested in London to a degree that other parts of England just haven't seen. And I'm not just making a point about the north there, by the way. I could be talking about Cornwall. I could be talking about East Anglia. The disparity is it always was there, actually, and it's even bigger. And the government that Sally and I were connected with did some things, but didn't actually change the fundamentals of that. And that is because it's hardwired into the British political system. The way in which the Green Book that the Treasury uses allocates public funding. It's basically an economic test. So the areas that score best for infrastructure investment are the places that already have the strongest economy. So more goes to more. And that is basically a big problem. So that's problem number one that Kerslake exposed. Problem number two is the marmot, what comes of that in terms of equity and particularly health equity. And the Marmot Review 10 years on concluded that since 2010, so the 10 years between 2010 and 2020, life expectancy in England had stalled for the first time since 1900. And that there are marked, this, in his words, marked regional differences in life expectancy, particularly among people living in the more deprived areas in the north. And the biggest decrease in life expectancy was in the poorest 10% of neighbourhoods in the northeast, was his conclusion. They also concluded that large funding cuts have affected the social determinants, so education, housing, work, across the whole of England, but actually much more in the deprived areas outside of London and the southeast, which experienced the largest cuts. So basically that was in February, and then COVID hit. And the virus, in my view, ruthlessly attacked those kind of weaknesses that the Marmot report had pointed to. The areas where the housing was poorest, where the work was lowest paid. You know, many people in my part of the world worked all the way through the first lockdown. They never had a stay-at-home time. And because of the nature of work in some parts of England, and it would be true actually not so far from Cambridge as well, perhaps, you know, in parts of East Anglia, the insecure nature of that work means that people couldn't self-isolate if they were symptomatic because they wouldn't be paid. And also they were in work, unable to self-isolate, going home to quite crowded homes often, where it was difficult then for the virus to be contained. So, you know, people, there is a narrative that likes to blame people for the spread of the virus, and we've had this a lot during the pandemic, that it's the 24-hour party people of Manchester that have been breaking all the rules. And I don't think that's, maybe there's an element of that, but I think it's the same everywhere. And you've got that same, I don't think there's anything particularly different about Manchester in that regard. What is different is some of the structural inequalities. When you look at people's work, you look at people's housing, and that has given us the position that we are in. But it's actually more than that when you then look at how the government has responded. And this now takes me back to the sort of Kerslake analysis, because on top of those structural weaknesses exposed by Marmot, I think we've seen a return to the sort of default running of government. So in March, the government had an opportunity to localise the response to COVID. And I speak with some experience here because I am a former health secretary, and actually one of the few people who's dealt with a pandemic, a much milder one called swine flu, but it was a pandemic nonetheless. You know, we I think adopted a much more localised approach to that. But in this instance, local testing teams were stood down very early in this crisis. And instead of localising the response, the government centralised the response. And I think some of what has happened this year can be traced to that judgment, which in my view was the wrong judgment to make. They should have localized the response to COVID. And secondly, I think what you also had then was a return to some of the kind of traditional London-centric decision-making that I was alluding to earlier. So let's take the issue about the first national lockdown. As I was saying earlier, I think the North was less locked down than other parts because of the nature of people's work. Essential work, key workers, construction, manufacturing, warehousing, distribution, all of those sectors were still in work, and with all of the issues that I raised before. But then you kind of put into the mix, the decision was made about ending the national lockdown. I remember the day when I first got wind that they were going to lift national lockdown. And I remember kind of taking an intake of breath on the phone, saying to one of the head of comms at the Greater Manchester Combined Authority about how on earth could they even be thinking of it, because it just felt far too early for us. Because if you remember, the virus had sort of spread up the country from London and the southeast through the Midlands and then up to the northwest. And if you look at the statistics, we were some way behind. You know, we were probably three weeks behind. Yeah. And you know, I've got the dates, and if people are interested, Tali, I can show people the statistics, because on some of those key dates, when the first decision to move from stay at home to stay alert was made, you know, we were in a much different position. And then all the way through May and into June when the schools reopened. And I would say the decision to lift national lockdown was essentially a London-centric decision. It was not a decision that was looking at the spread of the virus across all places. And it came too early for us. And then you combine it with the message about get back out there and eat out to help out and go to the pub and all of that stuff. I think our fate was pretty much sealed at that point. And we went under local restrictions in late July. And you know, this is hard for people here. You know, I'm not saying I agreed to go under local restrictions because I could see the numbers myself were too high. But you know, that was, I think, because of a decision to lift national lockdown, which came too early for us, and we've been under those restrictions ever since, with all of the damage that has done. And then I would just add in a couple of other things about, you know, the style of decision making, the decision to centralise rather than localise. I think if I could let me illustrate it to you in the plainest way I possibly can. If you are to set up a test, trace, and isolate system through national outsourced contracts, by definition, it's going to struggle to join the dots in communities, like any call centre operation does. If you compare that with operating it through teams on the ground run by councils knocking on doors, you know, there is a very substantial difference between what those two approaches to an issue are able to do. So we have made critiques all year of the national test and trace system. And we've really uncovered actually now some of why it just doesn't work. And I'll give you one reason why it doesn't work. When somebody tests positive and gives their contacts in the same house, often they are in the same house. That's normally the contacts that are given. The national system tries to ring those people individually as though they're different people. And the phone keeps ringing and they stop answering it and they don't get through to the people. And it's a simple kind of illustration of how a national remote system doesn't work. If you envisage a different approach where somebody from the council would have knocked on their door and said, right, this person's positive, these people will need to isolate, here's some support, it would have been a fundamentally different approach. But that's basically where we've been. It's been a very centralised approach. And I would come back to it quite London-centric. So, Sally, you'll remember when I had to cancel this talk last time, I was in the middle of those discussions with the government. And they were asking us to go under even tighter restrictions in Tier 3 and not funding us for the consequences that would cause. You might remember they were going to close pubs, bookmakers, bingo halls, and give people a 67% furlough. You know, I couldn't justify that. Couldn't justify the fact that there'd be no self-employment support. I knew we were damaged already because of being in the Tier 2 restrictions since July, August. And I knew if we'd gone into Tier 3, we'd have been damaged further still. Now, I want you all to know, I did not manufacture the sort of showdown, if you like. I was putting distress messages into the system all the way through. Originally, the tier system was going to come with no financial support, and we moved the government a bit, but it still wasn't enough. And hence still some of those scenes that you saw playing out. But, you know, the day after, and my argument to Boris Johnson had been, we've been in tier 2 since July. So you've got to recognise that's kind of eroded our kind of capability, if you like, our businesses, our councils. We need some funding recognition of that to now go into these tougher restrictions. That was denied. That led to the breakdown of the talks. But 2 days later, on the back of lobbying from London, London was given tier 2 support, and they realised they would have to backdate it for us. And I just think, you know, this, I hope you can see here that this year is bringing out what I've been trying to argue here about the unequal way in which the country is run. And obviously I made my critique about that. So what's the answer? And I would argue the answer is to move to a much more devolved approach to life. If you look around the world for countries that have done this better, I think you will find your answer in places like Germany, where there is a much more balanced national to regional political system. It's just healthier. The closer that decisions are taken to where people live, the more accountable those people are for making those decisions, the more they're informed by the real intelligence that they know about their communities. England needs to embrace, in my view, significant devolution of power out of Westminster. And that would, if we had that, we would have mounted a much more efficient and effective response to the pandemic, in my view. So I'm going to finish just with a kind of more personal thing, really, about why I'm here, where I am, and, you know, how I've ended up who I am, having come through FITS. And because Sally's right, I mean, I did leave. I went to school in St Helens, like the wonderful new master of Fitzwilliam College. I left that area to go to FITS in 1988. And that, I guess, was the first time in my life when I had a sense of England as two worlds. You know, love, and FITS, actually, God bless it, was the college that gave state school pupils much more of a chance. And I came in through the pool. But I remember being disorientated by the sense of two worlds. And I couldn't relate my old world to my new one. When I went back home for Christmas, everyone was taking the mickey because of my Cambridge sort of ways. And then in Cambridge, everyone would take the mickey about my kind of northern ways. And then in 1989 at FITS, that event that Sally mentioned that would come to define me politically, I guess, Hillsborough happened. And, you know, I was in the Easter holiday break of my first year at that time. And I had so many friends that I'd been at school with at Hillsborough. And I couldn't, when I came back for the summer term, I couldn't, with everything that was then going on and the kind of denigration of the Liverpool supporters, this was my sort of political formative years, if you like. I wasn't particularly politically active at college. But when I left, I kind of, I guess, was a bit radicalized by all of these things, and kind of working in my first job in London, got involved in the 1992 general election. To cut a long story short, I eventually found my way into Parliament via a wonderful person called Tessa Jowell, who gave me my first job in politics. And then somebody called Sally Morgan, who used to work in number 10 Downing Street, told me one day that she couldn't really give me any help, but I should think about putting my name forward for the vacancy in Lee, because aren't you from somewhere around there? She said to me, and I said, well, yes, I am, as it happens. And actually, my kind of world changed in that moment. It really did. And I all of a sudden focused on that and got elected. And in some ways do what politicians do, ambitious, wanting to get on in Parliament, and don't regret any of that. And I'm very proud of the government, the two governments, that prime ministers and governments that I served in. But because of my background, because of who I was, in some ways I still couldn't reconcile two worlds. My constituency of Lee, like being at Cambridge with Parliament, it was just, I constantly struggled to reconcile those two worlds. And those two worlds of mine absolutely collided with spectacular sort of force at Anfield in 2009, when I was Culture Secretary and asked to speak to that 20th anniversary service. And in effect, I had a big decision to make at that point. Was I going to go and just say the lines that the government I was in would have told me to say? Or was I going to be honest with myself and say that I knew that those 20,000 people there that day were right and the government I was in was wrong? And obviously I chose that course. And yet that in some ways set me on a slightly different path, and kind of made me think that I would never ever be able to sort of reform or challenge I went into Westminster to speak for the North, to try and even up the country. And I kind of concluded in the end that I couldn't do it really. And I would have to try and kind of do it from the outside. So that brings me to the role I'm in now. I think it's the right role for me. I feel liberated. I feel energized in what I'm doing. I am trying to build a new politics in England to address all of the things that I would come back to have been exposed by this year, which is a deeply unequal country where people are living very different lives depending on what job they do and which place they live in, and actually a political system that isn't capable of correcting it because it created it. Westminster created this. So therefore, something different is needed to correct it. And that something different is devolution to the English regions. That is what, this will be my last job in politics as far as I can see. I am dedicated to building this up. The country desperately needs it, in my view. And God forbid, if we ever were to face another pandemic, hopefully England will have a regional tier of administration that will make us much more effective in dealing with it. Sally, I will leave it there.
Thank you very much indeed. That was brilliant. There's loads of questions. I'm just going to try and take some themes out, and then I'm going to come to some individuals as well. But on the theme specifically about next stages of devolution, I guess, how do you think that should move forward? I mean, do you think there should be a kind of blueprint across the country? Do you think there needs to be deals with particular regions or cities where they're ready for it? I mean, how do you get that moving forward in your view?
Well, the government is promising a white paper, and I hope it hasn't abandoned that because it didn't like what these new mayors are doing, and it wants to close the whole thing down. But I think it's a simple. I think in a way that the government we were in came up with the wrong devolution idea for England, which was that regional tier that was a new layer, and I do think that was probably, in retrospect, wrong.
Yeah.
To be fair to him, I think George Osborne came up with a much better model, which is take the building blocks of local government, build them up into combined authorities, and then create a central person who becomes, the kind of the single coordinator of that. So I want everywhere to have what we have in Greater Manchester. And Whitehall should stop thinking in terms of deals. In my experience, local government is more capable, less partisan, more mature than the political culture that you find in Westminster. And it shouldn't be the case that Westminster deigns to give somebody a deal. People should be able to claim a devolution arrangement, I think. We want to fill in the whole map of England, because what you begin to find is, if you take myself and the Liverpool City region, Steve Rotherham is my greatest friend in politics, the mayor of the Liverpool City region. We left Parliament together, we worked together. When you start to sort of see the critical mass of two city regions like ours working together, things become possible that are not possible when you've got isolated devolution outposts. I think if you fill in the map, devolution gets a critical mass that will really, I think, allow bottom-up change. And Sally, the most important thing I can say to the people on the call who might be skeptical about devolution, I can understand many people might be. If what I've said so far doesn't convince you, maybe this will. The great strength of devolution is that it allows you to start with something that unifies people. And that thing is place. Wherever you are on the political spectrum, people tend to want to see the place where they live prosper and do well, and they want to invest in that place and invest in seeing that happen. So people I find I work with people of all political persuasions because place is what unifies us, and it builds something bigger. And business finds it easier to work with a place-based system as opposed to a party-divided system that we get in Westminster. So Westminster puts party before place. Devolution allows you to put place before party. And that's the way I approach it. And my argument is you can build a healthier political culture with that as your starting point than you can in the tribal tit-for-tat sort of point-scoring divides of Westminster.
Thanks, Andy. Eleanor, you want to ask your question? And I'm going to come to Jack next.
Hi.
Good to see you again.
You too. When you were elected in Greater Manchester, one of your biggest policies was to end rough sleeping and homelessness. What do you think you've been able to draw from the COVID-19 response to sort of help you be able to achieve that?
A lot, actually, Eleanor, and it's helped us go further on what we were already trying to do. So go back to when I came in 2017, rough sleeping was rising quite a lot. I did make it my top personal priority to do something about that. By this time last year, we had cut it by about 50%. So it was about 270 people sleeping rough in 2017, and we dropped it to about 140 this time last year. And I'd launched something called a bed every night, which was a scheme that was just providing shelter provision across Greater Manchester. The key was, it wasn't just a bed every night, it was the same bed every night. Because once somebody comes into one of our shelters, they can stay in the same place. And that's really crucial, because the revolving door thing where people are in and they're out, you can't recover from homelessness if you're constantly, not knowing where you are one day to the next. And then we got into the pandemic, and we were in discussions with the government about making a bed every night, available to everybody all the way through the pandemic. And we helped shape everyone in, actually, working with the government, and they did absolutely the right thing. And, everyone in took it up a level, because a bed every night was shelter provision. But with the pandemic and the need for people to be isolated and have their own room, we then took it on a level to hotel provision. All the feedback I've had from people who've been involved with everyone in says it's been brilliant, because give somebody a hotel room with a shower and a bathroom within it, it just gives them their dignity back instantly. And when you have that, everything then can kind of follow, can't it? Because you're in a settled place, you feel better about yourself, you then can turn things around. If you're kind of constantly, as I say, pushing people from pillar to post in the shelter one night out, that just doesn't work. So everyone in is absolutely, I would argue, you cannot have anything in life without good housing behind you and stable housing. Mm. And for me, everyone in proves that, because a lot of people have kind of ended a cycle of rough sleeping this year because of everyone in. And I just think you've got to take that principle and put it at the heart of everything, really. In Finland, they have a philosophy of housing first. Nationally, all the departments, health, education, everyone signs up to housing first, because they recognize that you don't have good, like Marmot was saying, you don't have health unless you have good housing behind you, those social determinants. And yet here, we kind of almost leave housing as a bit of a sort of, you're lucky if you can get it type approach. I personally think we should implant the principles of everyone in at the heart of housing policy generally, get back to a point where let the market provide for housing for those who can, but build social housing for those who won't be able to afford market rents. And I think the country would be more stable, healthier, if we got back to a vision of housing that was very much more aligned to the post-war vision than the one we have now.
Thanks, Andy. Jack, you've asked various things. Try and pull it into one question. You're not getting two goes, so.
Yeah, great. So as you can see in the background, Andy,
I
live in Wales. I live in Rail on the north coast of Wales, right. And obviously we've been devolved for about 20 years now. And in those 20 years, Wales has seen a significant increase, I think, in governance, especially recently, where Mark Drakeford has, I think it's quite clear to any right-thinking person that the leadership has been quite distinct, in the sense that he's been measured, he's been clear, everything that Boris Johnson hasn't. And in relation to where you've led Greater Manchester too, sort of to tie my two questions together, do you think that basically the reason Boris Johnson seems to treat devolution with such contempt at the moment is the fact that devolved leaders using their devolved powers have shown him up for his ineptitude in leadership?
Ooh, I could say so much about that. I'll try and keep it not so, there are lots, yeah. I mean, I think he would have been better early on, as I say, localising and putting us all on Cobra properly. So Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland have been on it, and Sadiq Khan has been on it. But I kept saying, put us on it, and they never did. And I think if they'd been getting that intel through us all the way through, I think it would have been better. Boris, I think, is a former mayor, and he understands where we're coming from. I think the truth of it is not that he said these comments this week, which I don't know if they were a bit off the cuff or what, but I think he understands devolution because he used to argue for it as mayor of London. I think what the people who don't understand it are basically the big Whitehall departments and the civil servants. They don't want it. They don't see why they should give up any of their power. And I think what's happened this year is essentially a fairly new prime minister thrown into the pandemic has not been able to sort of assert, the system is asserting itself rather than he's not asserting what he wants yet in terms of his government's agenda. I think there's, I do admire Mark and what he's done, and Nicola Sturgeon, I think, has been excellent this year, to be fair as well. I still think, though, that what you have in Wales and what they have in Scotland is different to what I'm arguing for, because that is still national devolution. And I would argue in Scotland, particularly, they're using it to build an argument for independence. So everything's hoovered up to the national level. They've created Police Scotland and everything's Scotland, if you know what I mean. And I still think that is taking power up and away from the cities of Scotland and the communities of Scotland to build a political project. And I'm not sure that is the devolution. Well, I'm not sure. I don't want that devolution. I think in Wales, the context is slightly more different, but North Wales is harder to sort of connect with South Wales, isn't it? I think South Wales has done better out of devolution. I would probably argue than North Wales.
Incredibly, yeah, the North-South divide is very real in Wales as well. Yeah.
So I would say to Mark and to Nicola, to the extent that either of them would listen to me, you should run your own devolution project. The difference I keep saying to people between my old job as health secretary and my new job as mayor of Greater Manchester is, in my old job, I could see numbers, not names. In my current job, I can see names, not numbers. When you build change from the bottom up, I think it's always better change, in my view. Power closer to people leads to power being used better, I think. And, I think more rooted devolution is the kind that I would like to see more of.
Andy, what range of issues do you think should be handled, should be devolved properly?
I think pretty much the full suite of domestic policy issues, Sally. I'm not saying it's full, unbridled devolution. You can have policy frameworks, can't you? The weighting standards that you expect in the NHS, the education standards, but you don't devolve the what of what people should be entitled to. What you devolve is the how. How do we achieve that in this area? So, if you take the example in education, technical education has never been done well by Whitehall. It's always been treated as the poor relation. So I think there's a snobbery there about it that means it never gets an equal look in as the academic side of education. But I think it's also because technical education also has to be very linked to local economies. Preparing people for the jobs that actually exist within an economy means prioritizing certain things in one area. So in the West Midlands, they might prioritize automotive, whereas in our part of the world, we would prioritize advanced manufacturing or digital or something like that. So skills policy, I think, has to be devolved. If you're good, the government has talked about a local industrial strategy. Well, it won't work unless you have a local skills strategy. So I would say all the main public spending areas, health, crime, transport, planning, housing, I would devolve the DWP budget. You run the DWP is like a top-down tick box, computer says no regime, isn't it? It doesn't actually personalize support for that individual. We have an element of DWP devolution under the work programme, and we have been twice as successful at getting people back into the labour market who've been long-term out of the labour market. And it is because we put mental health at the heart of our approach, and it's much more personalised. So I think most of the main domestic policy areas need a substantial element of devolved power.
And what's the fiscal framework for that? where are you on fiscal devolution or tax raising powers? Or, or is it within a policy framework or a target framework, but actually you're then kind of handed the finances?
Yeah, I'd say pretty much we've got begging bowl devolution at the moment, where we're constantly having to go cap in hand to Whitehall saying, can we have some funding for this and have some funding for that? And hence, this isn't true devolution, because when they say no, and I go out on the streets and say, we're not having this because this isn't good enough, then immediately they say, well, we're not having any more of this devolution because they're getting above themselves, kind of thing. So begging bowl devolution is not true devolution, I don't think. Wales has a measure of true devolution. Scotland certainly does. I have a small mayoral precept, Sally, that goes on people's council tax bills. And it is building, but it is modest at the moment. It's, it raises 10 or so million pounds a year. I use it to pay for what Eleanor was mentioning, a bed every night. And the main thing I've used it for was to deliver free bus travel to all 16 to 18-year-olds in Greater Manchester, because public transport is much more expensive in our part of the world than it is certainly in London. So, connecting young people to opportunity is a big theme of mine. So it's modest, though, is all I'm saying. We've done some things with it, but it's modest.
One of the questions, there's this stuff coming in on chat as well as the Slido ones. How at the moment, you said you've been talking to Whitehall, and we've seen you out on the TV screens or standing outside, Manchester Town Hall or wherever. I mean, are there sane people? Is there a unit for you to talk to? Is there? I mean, you've got Boris. Half the people who have now gone out of who were in number 10. Who are you? Is there a sane unit with whom you can have a conversation about the running of COVID, or is it as chaotic as it appears?
It has felt fairly ad hoc and at times chaotic this year, because you have different relationships with all of these different Whitehall policy silos. Yeah. Some more supportive of devolution than others. Yeah. Department for Education, not supportive. Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, pretty supportive. Health, bit in the middle. This is where we are with devolution. You've not even got one view from government. You've got the fiefdoms of Whitehall all having slightly different views about it. And it makes it very hard to have one structured conversation with government about what we need.
I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. People are interested specifically in transport. I mean, partly, did you learn to cycle? Were you on a bike in Cambridge, I suppose? Was it the experience of coming back up the hill that made
I had a real
seriously about cycling? And where are you on buses? I mean, does COVID make you change your view on buses, or are you still committed as an authority to franchise buses? Where are you? Where are you going on transport policy?
So I had an old sort of wrought iron bone shaker that I brought with me to Cambridge, because I was like perfecting my Morrissey look in those days. People who remember me, it's had a big sort of Morrissey quiff, and I used to be on my old fashioned sit up and beg bike like Morrissey. But I can remember going up Castle Hill some days when the wind was coming back down on that bike, and I must have lost 4 stone at times, I think, in certain terms doing that. That lives with me, Sally. So yeah, I think Cambridge was true cycling city, even in those days, even more so now. It's fantastic. We'd all like to be like that. On buses, they've got to change. The deregulation of buses, obviously London never had deregulation. London kept a regulated system. The deregulation of buses outside of London, it was sold on it will become cheaper because there'll be all this competition. There'll be all these routes that will be provided. There'll be new buses. Anyone who lives in Greater Manchester will tell you that the complete opposite has happened. Prices have gone up, routes have been cut, old buses on the roads. It does not and has not worked in any way, shape or form. And what you get is buses compete with the tram. So you don't have an integrated system. A single bus ticket in Greater Manchester can cost £4. £4. £1.50 for a bus journey in London. I keep saying to the government, we will not have levelled up until a single bus journey costs the same in Greater Manchester as it does in London. But it's worse, Sally, because you can't have a daily cap over what people can spend when you have a fragmented system like that. So if you're in Greater Manchester and you get on a bus and then you jump on the tram, you pay again as a new customer, and it doesn't see what you spent on the bus. And so consequently, public transport is way more expensive in Greater Manchester. And what I want is a single integrated London-style system that covers bus, tram, and hopefully eventually train, that has a cap on what people can spend in any given day. That is the single biggest thing that we could do to enhance the productivity and to connect people to opportunity in the cities outside of London. I'm sorry to say, but outside of London, car is absolutely king. It's cheaper to use your car, it's easier, it's more reliable. The rest of it just does not work. And I keep saying to the government, levelling up should be about everyday transport in the here and now, not promising HS2 in 30 years.
Thank you. Sophie Metcalf, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, please. So my question is about austerity. I thought, to what extent do you feel devolved leaders can resist central government imposed austerity? So sort of going back to what you were saying, I suppose, about the sort of begging, and kind of how do you envisage that? And sort of following on from that, could you ever foresee a Manchester basic income, for instance?
I could. I would love that if we were able to do that, because I think what I was saying about housing, if you give people a basic foundation, I think you create the conditions for far less social failure and the costs of far less social failure. It can't happen overnight, but I would like to move to a situation where we were able to raise more of what we felt we needed to raise, where we had more fiscal freedom to do that, and then take responsibility for showing how it, by raising the money to, let's give you an example. If we had the freedom today to build council housing or social housing, we would do it. Why? Because councils across Greater Manchester, Manchester City Council particularly, this is how Whitehall doesn't work. When they put a cap on benefits, and when they cut what's called the local housing allowance in the universal credit system, basically they were ensuring that the money people were given for their housing was not keeping pace with rents. Councils saw a massive increase in families presenting as homeless as a result of that, and huge extra costs with regard to temporary accommodation. So this is the problem with the way Whitehall works. One policy silo makes a cut that shunts costs onto another part of the system. And one of my arguments for what we want to do is, if you devolve public spending across the board, you will actually get much more efficient public service delivery, where you can join up the dots at local level and make things work as one system effectively, one preventative system, as opposed to these kind of fragmented silos that are always reactive and spend a lot of money dealing with crisis, as opposed to having invested in people when they most needed personalised support. So I would say devolve public services, integrate them around the individual and the family, but allow areas also to top that up with those freedoms and the borrowing permissions, so that you can create proper solutions for communities. So won't happen overnight, Sophie, but absolutely. And I like the idea of universal basic income. I think it makes a lot of sense.
Andy, we've got a question, I don't know who it's from, about how do you, when you're so busy, how do you stay in touch with people? How do you make sure that you are properly hearing the range of views you need to sort of devise sensible and practical policies, I guess? And I'd like to add to that, which is, how do you take the arguments that you've been making to us this evening out and build support for that? What's the mechanism? What's the process for trying to do that? Not just in Greater Manchester, but the broader arguments. How do you build support for that?
Yeah, good question, Sally. The first one I would say is I've changed, in some ways, over the years, my style of politics, in that I just like to get out and about in a very normal way. I don't like going cutting ribbons in a suit so much anymore. I just like to go out and about for a drink after work. I go to watch music in Manchester. You know, I'm always around and about, and I just like people coming up to me and saying, "Oh, why don't you think about this or that?" Picking up those straws in the wind, and that keeps me in touch. It seems to work for me. Keep it more informal, I would say, and I'd say that to all politicians. Better to operate like that, I think, than always sort of turning up for the opening of an envelope and in your best suit with your tie on, etc. In terms of the second thing, I very much, as I said before, left Westminster to make the argument for this change that I'm involved in, and I kind of said to my team at the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, if we become a local regional story only of interest to Granada reports, then we're failing, to be honest, because we have to project our argument onto a sort of bigger level. So if people can kind of remember maybe some of the issues that we've raised, but the train chaos was a big one, where in times gone by, when the timetable chaos hit, nobody would have heard that people in the north were spending 4 hours to get home. It just wouldn't have featured on the Today programme. And we started to niggle the Today programme with it, because when the timetable thing happened, it was just Thameslink that they were reporting on, and we used social media to sort of put some reverse pressure on them. And if you remember, the chaos on the railways in the north became quite a big national story. And then that allowed us to talk about the sort of transport inequality between investment in London versus investment in the north. And that helped, I think, kind of get onto the national stage, both the issue of inequality between the regions, but also how devolution might be a vehicle to fix it. So I've been thinking all the way through this about how do I make the issues that matter to us national issues, and I think we've had some success in doing that.
How do you make sure that devolution doesn't cause more fragmented communications? I mean, how do you take what's best of national stuff? So somebody was asking on here about the NHS. To what extent can healthcare be devolved, and are national digital systems necessary to be part of that? You've probably had your fingers burnt actually thinking about national digital systems in your
we do, if you remember, Sally. So actually, what that experience showed is that national digital systems are a very, very risky thing to do, to be honest. And you're better off going with a more localized, personalized approach. It's what I was saying before, though. Don't devolve the what citizens are entitled to. Keep the national entitlements in place. Just devolve more freedom as to how people meet those entitlements within the different locality where they live. But your other part of your question about how do we stop it all becoming a major free-for-all and a postcode lottery, which is a really fair question. It's early days, but as I said before, I work very closely with my colleague down the East Lancs Road, as we said before, in Liverpool. So we are both developing a policy called a Good Employment Charter, where we are linking public procurement to what we would call good work. So real living wage, secure contracts, not 0 hours contracts, close the gender pay gap, more flexible working. And we both deliberately decided to do exactly the same thing, so that companies that operate across that East Lancs or M62 corridor don't say, oh, well, you're asking us to do this in Liverpool and this in Manchester, we can't make sense of it. So we recognise it's incumbent on us to coordinate where we need to coordinate. And I think that is important in devolution. It will lose support if devolution just becomes a complete patchwork of madness.
Yeah. Martin Lewis, you've got a good question. Is he there? Don't know where he is. I'll ask you.
I'm here.
Yeah, go on, Martin. You ask your question.
I want to ask about what you thought, Andy, should the skill set be for a good metro devolved mayor. Here in West Yorkshire, we're getting ready for mayoral elections. It wasn't so much about like good interpersonal skills and GCSEs and stuff like that, but whether, these roles really require somebody with a pre-existing national profile, or whether, you look to somebody who's come up through the local government system, perhaps been an effective, council leader, that kind of thing.
And there's been other questions around that actually about skill. Are there different skills? Does it get tested as a minister, or is it completely different, or is it complementary?
I think the role I have, Martin and Sally, I think it's quite akin to a cabinet level job, to be honest, in terms of. So I found my experience actually has really helped me a lot, both in terms of how I run my own operation, but also how I deal with Westminster. So people will have different views, but I find my time in Westminster is massively important to me in how I then sort of, relay back to it in my current role. But I don't think it's a prerequisite by any means. I think what Westminster can use sometimes is the low profile of politicians out of London to sort of ride roughshod over them. So I personally would say a degree of profile does probably help, but I don't think it's essential. And actually, to be honest, maybe the first wave of mayors will establish the role by using our profile. But I think for the generation that comes behind us, I don't think that's a prerequisite at all, to be honest, because I think the systems hopefully will be established by then. I think it's marvellous that West Yorkshire is getting a mayor. You know, we want to see some women metro mayors around the country as well. You know, I think we need to bring through a kind of generation of people here that are, you know, different, if you like, to the way politicians work in Westminster. And I mentioned this thing before about it being liberating. I've come to the view that the reason why you're all, many of you on this call, perhaps some of the old people of an older age on the call, are disenfranchised with Westminster politics. What I found was, it, in the end, makes a fraud out of you the longer that you stay there, because it almost asks you to toe a line all the time and say things that you might not 100% believe in, vote in ways that might kind of make you kind of like your eyes water when things you believe in, because of that party whip system. So consequently, you often say, why don't they say what they think, or why don't they answer the question? It does that to people. And I think the mayoral role allows people to be what they want to be and speak in the way that they want to speak. And I think it does connect people with politics more. And therefore, I think for that next generation coming through, it's a much better ground for people to come in and establish that persona, rather, because actually Westminster means you almost have to kind of re-show that you are a bit human after all. Whereas, you know, coming through the mayoral role in the first instance, I think would create more formidable politicians, and in the end would then go to Westminster and be better politicians as well. So in the early days, I hope this answers the question. I hope I'm not overcomplicating it. It's probably going to work better, people coming out of Westminster and doing these roles. But I hope in the second and third generation of mayors, it will be people coming through and using the new freedom to be a sort of a, you know, powerful, creative, energetic person yourself, rooted to your place, and then going to Westminster will make Westminster better as well, I think.
Although that didn't happen with leaders of local authorities in the past, did it? Of any party, actually. They were often very big figures and then got lost at Westminster quite quickly.
That does happen a lot, but I do think of my great friend David Blunkett, Sally. You know, I think David is, you know, somebody who, you know, you would say, you know, but yes, you're right, it's not always happened. But I think council leadership doesn't give you that sort of, the mayoral role can give you that extra sort of clout and presence, I think, that maybe you struggle to get as a local authority leader.
Yeah. I'm going to ask an inevitable question. This is, I promise, is not mine, but it's been asked by quite a few people. Yeah, what would have happened if you'd won in 2015? And you, I mean, listening to you, you don't sound to me like you're terribly sad about it. But what do you feel about it now?
Oh God, so many feelings. But yeah, I don't know. I made so many mistakes in that campaign. I mean, you know, I look back on it and cringe a bit, really. But it's kind of everything that I was saying. I was being somebody I wasn't, and therefore, you know, I just couldn't find my voice in the way that I wanted to in that campaign. But I see my other half is here in the house. She went to Fitz as well. And for those of you who know her, anyone who's ever had any interaction with her, she doesn't mince her words. She tells me as it is. She tends to give me kind of text messages after I've been on the media that kind of sort of go answer the F * question whenever you know, she kind of isn't that hot, kind of, you know, easygoing, let's put it that way. But the only thing she's ever said to me is that she thinks that if I'd have won in 2015, Brexit might not have happened because I might have just had a bit more reach into the north that was kind of, you know, feeling, you know, was kind of heading in the Leave direction. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not, but I think it probably would have been a slightly different referendum campaign had I been in that position.
Yeah, good answer. An easier one, this one. What do you think about the proposed Ox-Cam arc? This is from Rachel. Do you think it'll help level up the national economy or make the divides worse?
I like the idea of it. No, I'm not don't want to sound like I do often sound like professional northerner and all of that. No, I want to see all regions prosper, and Cambridge and Oxford bring massive prosperity, and that prosperity can cascade out into East Anglia and also, you know, parts of the West Country and the Midlands. So no, I'd like to see that develop. It's a critical kind of cluster, if you like, for the country, isn't it, as well? All the things we're hearing about on the vaccine, etc. You know, this is crucial to the prosperity of the country, and it's just we've got to get better maybe at linking the expertise that goes on in Cambridge with sort of maybe the more manufacturing heartlands of the country, as to how we kind of make those networks work for the UK as a whole.
Mm. Final question, and then if you want to say anything to finish, over to you. And it's a broad question, but it's been, a lot of people have asked something like this, and I think you alluded to it actually when you talked at the beginning. But tell us a bit more about how your experience at Cambridge and I suppose at Fitzwilliam affected you, and to what extent has it affected any of your thinking since you left, and what advice have you got to other people, I think, about how to take the experience they've got while they're here and think about the future?
Thank you. That's a really important question. I mean, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing were it not for Fitz. I mean, that's the first thing to say. I mean, it gave me a kind of horizon that I couldn't have opened up if I was somewhere else. In the end, I think what I would say is, and I maybe some of the undergraduates on the call will know what I mean when I say this. It was hard because of the kind of confidence effect it had on me at first. I kind of did always wait for that tap on the shoulder. I was kind of convinced they'd made a mistake with me and I was on borrowed time. I mean, people will know that feeling. I can see a couple of nods there and Jack's nodding. I mean, you know that feeling, and it took me a while to feel like I kind of swim in those Cambridge waters. But when I felt I could, then everything started to change. So the key to me is, how do we implant that sort of inner confidence that isn't sort of given to you when you grow up in certain parts of the country? And that is like a thing that it was I wouldn't say it was touch and go, but in my first year at Fitz, I really struggled, I guess, to make the transition. For those who remember me, we used to have an old bar that's long gone, but I would spend a lot of time in there on the pool table, and yeah, I had a great time, by the way, and it was fantastic. And as I've just said, I met my future wife, but it took me a while to feel confident in my own sort of ability at Cambridge. But yeah, I mean, I look back at it now and know that it changed my life fundamentally. And Fitz was always very kind to me, in terms of the mix of Fitz helped. If I hadn't have been in the mix of Fitz, the sort of social mix of it, I don't think I would have, really, it would have been touch and go whether I would have survived at Cambridge if I'd been in one of the more traditional colleges. But, we had a sort of, in those days, Fitz had a bit of a sort of us against the rest sort of mentality. And we were the best at football within Cambridge by a long degree. And the other colleges used to call us red brick whenever we played. Get the red bricks, they used to say.
We're still the best at football, Andy. You'll be very relieved to know.
I'm relieved to hear that, because there's a big tradition there at Fitz. So that's good to know that, Sally. So yeah, Fitz gave me so much. In the end, when I got to my third year, I had sort of found an academic confidence and was thinking about careers that just I wouldn't have thought about. But I do think it was the community of Fitz enabled me to sort of to keep going and felt I belonged. The college made me felt I belonged to the college, and I still do. So we're very, very grateful to Fitz. Actually, I am, and my other half is, and I'm sure people who are there today feel the same. I
think it's really interesting hearing you, because actually I think we'd have exactly the same conversations with people now. I think we're still, I think as a community, very conscious that people come from all sorts of different backgrounds, and we've got to support people finding their feet and finding their way, because if they do, it's a fantastic experience for the future. So I think what you say is still the same, actually.
I think it's harder for the generation now, if I could just say, Sally. I think, the pressures on young people are greater, I think, than they were. I think we lived in a slightly more settled, stable time. I think, my son is at UCL now, and, I kind of hear from him about some of the mental health challenges of some of his peers. I think this generation has grown up with much more pressure upon them all the way through exams and all the different things, and finances are a pressure on people that they weren't. I used to go to the old Porter's Lodge at Fitz every month, once a month, and collect my big, fat, juicy cheque from Cheshire County Council, I think I remember. And that was my grant.
Yeah.
So that wasn't even my tuition fees. They were just taken care of.
Yeah.
That was my grant for my living expenses. And can you imagine that now to any student who's at Fitz going and getting a cheque from your council every 3 months? It was kind of amazing. I mean, that, you know, so we had it much easier than all of you. But I do think we've got to work harder at young people's mental health these days. I think it is a much bigger challenge. And I do think if I had a challenge to you, Sally, and to the college, it would be back on the interview process. Now, I don't know how much that has changed at Fitz. And it was actually much better, my interview at Fitz, by the way, than the one I had at St. Catherine's, which I failed miserably. I remember it. I went into this oak panelled room at St. Catherine's. I say oak panelled, you couldn't see the oak panels because there were just books everywhere. I was not 17 probably, from, as I say, from Newton Lee Willows and near you in St. Helens. The first thing I was offered was a glass of sherry, which nearly made me, I didn't have a clue what to say. I said yes, because I generally would have drunk most things in those days. And then the first question in the interview was, to what extent did I think the Canterbury Tales was the equivalent of a modern package day holiday? And I remember sitting there with this sherry, looking at him, and I think the way I put it is, I was still pondering I don't think any words came out of my mouth, and I was still pondering the question when the rejection letter sort of landed on the doormat 3 days later. I then went to Fitz for an interview through the pool, and it was daunting, but I was a little better prepared, let's say, for that one. But I do think that for those from, let's say, less affluent backgrounds who haven't been taught to be as confident as young people, perhaps who go to independent schools, the interview process is so disorientating that talent gets lost at that stage. And I just think the talent might need to be a bit more supported through the shock to the system that is the Cambridge or Oxford interview.
I mean, I think, and we must stop because I've promised you that we'd do an hour. We could go on for ages. I think we're acutely aware here of what you say. I mean, I mean, there's lots of people on this call tonight who do interviews, and I think they would really want to say that they think they do it terribly differently than you've described. But actually, what's interesting this year is that in some ways, I was saying to you before we started, you know, never waste a crisis. Actually, one of the effects of COVID is that we've probably had all sorts of people coming to open days because they're online who wouldn't normally come to open days. And interviews will be online as well. So in a way, I think we will learn from this whole experience to make sure that we keep pushing ahead. But certainly everybody is very conscious about trying to make people relax, take account of where of how they've got even to the interview process. And we were very, very on the case on that in the summer, you know, with the admission to Barclay.
Great to hear that. I think the one thing you can't lose though is that kind of high standard and that
Absolutely.
sort of
People
have to sink or swim, don't they? They have to be able to kind of think on their feet and show that they can and show they've got something about them. So I agree with all of that. It's just that it is such a shock to the system that I think people get stunned by it, and I think then don't, you know, and it's how you can kind of teach them just to get into the water before you then ask them to swim in those.
I'm finish with a comment from Paul, our senior tutor, who says, we still think interviews help us with a lot of care to bring people in from every background and with a range of track records academically. And we do think it lets us meet people who otherwise wouldn't actually have got as far. So, but we're working on it. We're not
promise me one thing, Sally. You'll never look at my notes, what my fellows wrote on those notes, because they would be excruciating. My Fitz interview.
Andy, thank you very much indeed.
No problem.
It's been great talking to you, and I know.
I've loved it. And let me give that final message to particularly to the undergraduates on the call. You know, savor every moment at it is a great college. You know, it will do so much for you. You know, it is a privilege to be there, and I look back on every moment I spent there. I can see you all nodding. It really is. It's a wonderful college. You've got a wonderful master as well, which I also know, somebody who's did something else. Fitz did something decisive for me, but so did Baroness Morgan, because I wouldn't have gone on to do what I did had she not pointed me in the right direction at a critical moment. But I would just say to you all, it sounds corny, but if I was your age and people had said I could have done these things that I've done, I wouldn't have been able to actually conceive of how I would have done that. And I think that all the critiques I've made of our country tonight, and I do make sort of pretty trenchant critiques of how things are, it is still quite a meritocratic country if you apply yourselves, if you go at what you want to do with confidence and you know why you want to do it. And if you're following a passion, you know, in the end, people in this country do open those doors for you, and you can get on and you can kind of achieve things that you might not have thought were possible. So I would just say use everything you've got while you're there, you know, enjoy it to the full. Don't only work, you know, maybe don't do as much as we did in our day. I think you probably do have to work harder these days than we used to. But yeah, I think that is true. I think the Onions has been disbanded, hasn't it, Master? that was a part of my spare time when I was there. But I would just say, you know, leaving college will be hard because it's a kind of very supported sort of world. And, you know, I remember leaving FITS, having finally felt at home at FITS, a terrible sort of thing once I'd had to leave it. But actually be ready for that, but also be ready then to sort of use everything that you've learned there. And yeah, keep your ambitions very, very high indeed, and draw on everything the college has given you. So thank you, Sally. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in.
Thanks, Andy. Good luck with everything. See you soon. Bye-bye.
And to you. Okay, bye, everyone.